In this video, we're going to learn about the Washington Consensus, which underpins the US-led world order, why the Washington Consensus seems to be crumbling, and what this means for us as those who search for truth on our journey towards financial freedom. In 2017, Donald J. Trump became US president against all the odds. This outsider, with little existing political capital or connections within Washington, D.C., fought a controversial campaign.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
And the world couldn't look away. First, he won the Republican nomination, beating out more respectable establishment candidates like Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush.
You're the basket case.
Jeb Bush is a low-energy person.
Trump's election wasn't just shocking because the man himself was offensive, rude, or unpresidential. No, Trump's election was shocking because it represented a violent and widespread rejection of the establishment political class. In the wake of his election and throughout his presidency, the world watched as these so-called deplorables mobilized in support of their savior, while the rest of America rose up to form the resistance. But it wasn't just American citizens, Democrat voters, who came through to reject Trump's leadership and run interference on his agenda. Most mainstream media outlets, three-letter agencies and corporations seemed terrified by the direction in which Trump was determined to take the country. To one side, Trump's election was a signal that a huge chunk of the American electorate were backwards, regressive, racist misogynists who threatened the social progress made over the past few decades. To the other, the reaction to Trump's election was a signal that democracy in America was an illusion, that politics was a soap opera to distract citizens from the corporate oligopoly, media establishment and deep state that were really running the country. So, who was right? Neither of them.
We got a lot of fun up here tonight, I have to tell you.
Welcome back to the channel team. Now, on this channel, we're not interested in partisanship. We are interested in optimizing our information diets in order to understand the world as accurately as possible, to access truth and to empower ourselves on the road to financial freedom. While you're here, I'd love it if you could hit that like button, help me increase this video's visibility on YouTube, grow my audience. Leave a comment with any thoughts or feedback, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more. I've got some great videos planned coming up, releasing them weekly, Thursday or Friday, I haven't decided yet. Your information diet shapes your mind, your ability to make decisions, spot emerging trends that will change your circumstances and the world around you, and can put you in a position to create wealth for yourself, your family, and your community. Now, Donald Trump. Team, this man provides a great litmus test for your information diet. Whether you think Trump is some kind of devil or some kind of savior, if you cannot articulate why he got elected in macroeconomic and geopolitical terms, you need to fix your information diet. Because this guy's election illuminated the fact that all is not okay in the West. This event was a signal, another signal of something that we've been speaking about recently on this channel, that the current world order and social contract has become dysfunctional. It no longer works, and we are headed for massive change. In this video, we'll also talk about how and why Trump was a signal, an early warning sign of all of this. By the end of this video, you will understand what this man's election represented in geopolitical and macroeconomic terms, what it tells us about the health of the current world order, and what emerging trends to look out for over the next few years. Section 1. What is the Washington Consensus? In the wake of World War II, following 2 world wars in 30 years, society, politicians, and geopolitical rivals were desperate for lasting peace between nations. And so, the victorious nations set out to create a new world order which would create prosperity, security, and stability for the world. For developing nations, capital to invest in their economies. To develop nations, leadership roles for them to shape the new world as they saw fit. For the United States, the role of global steward. Now at this time, the United States economy and military towered above the rest, and it was this which allowed it to put itself in charge. In fact, in 1945, US GDP represented about 40% of global GDP, and not only that, but much of Russia, Europe, China and Japan lay in ruins after the war. The way that the US was to uphold this new world order was through the establishment of new global institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. One of the things these institutions do is uphold the Washington Consensus, a set of economic prescriptions which you must implement if you want to participate in the US-led economic and financial system. One way to frame this is that it's through these institutions that the US provides stability for the world and helps to support the economically less fortunate, globally speaking. Another way to frame it is that it is through these institutions that the US protects its own interests by demanding that developing nations play by their rules and opt into their system. When an economic crisis hits a developing nation, these institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury, often step in to save the day. They say to the leaders of these countries, we will lend you money if you make these specific economic reforms. This set of 10 reforms have been referred to as the Washington Consensus, and they are: fiscal policy discipline with avoidance of large fiscal deficits, redirection of public spending from subsidies towards services like education, healthcare and infrastructure investment, moderate marginal tax rates, market-determined interest rates, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalisation, liberalisation of inward foreign direct investment, privatisation of state enterprises, deregulation, legal security for property rights. This term, the Washington Consensus, is now used in a broader sense than this, to refer to things like neoliberalism or market fundamentalism. Others still have used it to refer to the consensus that the US should continue to be in the seat of global steward, economically, financially, militarily. So essentially, the Washington Consensus is the geopolitical and economic consensus that the US should remain top dog, with jurisdiction and authority over world affairs. Now, I'm going to use the term in its broadest sense to encompass all of the things which constitute US global leadership, so NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, the US dollar as global reserve currency, and the petrodollar system that underpins that. And more specifically, the ongoing legitimacy and international buy-in to this state of affairs. All of these things together keep the US in that role of top dog and gives the rather interventionist US government the power to shape world affairs as it sees fit.
Bomb them, keep bombing them, bomb them again and again.
Donald Trump's election was a big deal because he threatened a number of these things at a really fundamental level, questioning US commitments to NATO, for example. Trump was a United States president who threatened the very power structures which keep the US in the seat of global steward. So what propelled him to the presidency? Was it racism, deplorable people living in the past and holding on to old prejudices? Or could it be that the Washington Consensus, that thing which he threatened, was creating costs for sections of American society which they were no longer willing to pay? And this guy, in their minds, perhaps provided a way out.
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters.
Section 2. Evidence that the Washington Consensus is crumbling. In this section of the video, we're going to talk about 3 events which seem to suggest that the Washington Consensus and the United States' role as global steward seems to be crumbling and coming to the end of a chapter. First, let's cover something we've already spoken about on this channel. That is the loss of manufacturing jobs overseas. One thing that this system that the US has created allows businesses to do is to move their manufacturing bases overseas, and they have done just that. In order to remain competitive, businesses have to search for the cheapest sources of labour worldwide, which obviously don't tend to find themselves in developed nations with a relatively high cost of living and therefore higher wage demands. This has meant that working class people in the developed world, who might in times gone by have found a job in a factory or anywhere else that makes things, can't, because those jobs aren't here anymore, they're overseas. This means that those communities which relied on factories as a means of employment fall into economic decline. When you overlay the map of people who voted for Trump with the map of regions that have lost the most manufacturing jobs to globalization, you begin to see the pattern. These are the people bearing the costs of the Washington Consensus, and they're just not willing to do so anymore. I also spoke in my previous video about how not only does the map of support for Trump fit very well with the map of manufacturing jobs lost to globalization, it also fits very well with the map of the opioid crisis. The costs of this system are very real domestically within the US and within much of the developed world. US leadership didn't arrange this state of affairs because they're evil. They did it because the US benefited from it in other ways, and because they saw an opportunity to create stability for the rest of the world following a time of real crisis. Following the US's recent chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, nations around the world are beginning to question the US's ability and willingness to continue to intervene militarily in world affairs. China is stepping up its rhetoric around reabsorbing Taiwan and bringing it under CCP rule. Other nations who enjoy protection from the US, perhaps those in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, are probably looking at this and beginning to question how good US promises really are. Saudi Arabia, for example, whose partnership with the US when it comes to its guarantee to sell oil for US dollars, has just signed a military cooperation agreement with Russia. How long before this trend isn't just military, but economic too, with nations perhaps turning their back on the recommendations of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and instead looking to new alternatives? Not long. On this note, an honorary mention here has to go to El Salvador, who recently adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. Now, you can't just do this. Adopting this leaderless, independent, censorship-resistant global monetary network might make sense for your people, who can save massive amounts in remittance fees that they would otherwise lose to Western Union as they receive money from relatives working overseas. But doing something like this threatens your standing with these global institutions like the IMF. The adoption of Bitcoin is an affront to the US-led global world order, and Nayib Bukele is threatening their authority. In fact, he's directly addressed the costs and benefits of doing so. In an interview on the What Bitcoin Did podcast earlier this year, he basically said that El Salvador had nothing to lose by adopting Bitcoin. Although it might threaten some of their loans from the IMF, they don't control monetary policy of the US dollar, which they were using before. And plus, the current system leaves 70% of Salvadorians without banking and financial services. In the context of the Washington Consensus, this is a massive deal. A millennial leader of a sovereign nation state has looked at things from a selfish perspective in terms of what will most benefit his people, and decided that rather than lean into the Washington Consensus, he'd rather lean into Bitcoin. To be honest, I could speak about this all day, but let's bring it back to Trump, the crumbling Washington Consensus, and what this means for us on our path towards fixing our information diets on the road to financial freedom. The Washington Consensus, which underpins the US-led institutional world order, is crumbling. Donald Trump's election was a huge alarm bell that a hell of a lot is about to change, because his election is evidence that the US world order isn't even working for Americans. This is a state of affairs which cannot hold, and when it breaks, everything else will break along with it. We've spoken about how the narrative around Donald Trump obscured a larger story, and that if you fell into either of those teams, thinking all of Trump supporters are racist, and some of them are, or, this deplorable narrative, or if you fell into the idea that Trump was some sort of savior, genius, savant, master persuader who is going to fix everything for your team, you failed a test. You need to fix your information diet. How do we access truth? How do we keep our minds clear? These things are vital on our path towards financial freedom. An accurate model of the world is a crucial foundation for financial decisions. So in the spirit of fixing our information diets, here are 3 specific stories to pay attention to and follow the development of if you want to keep tabs on this story. Number 1, follow the China-Taiwan-US story. Specifically, does China invade Taiwan step up its military exercises, and does the US do anything in return? 2. Follow the Bitcoin El Salvador story. Do any other countries look like they might be following suit? 3. Follow the US dollar as world reserve currency story. Do other countries begin to settle trades with one another in something other than US dollars? Do any nations start selling oil for something other than US dollars? That the Washington consensus seems to be crumbling means a huge number of things are going to change throughout this next decade. I've spoken before on this channel about how we seem to be approaching the end of certain cycles, the long-term debt cycle and the fourth turning, things which suggest that we're coming to the end of a chapter in history. Donald Trump was the canary in the coal mine for the Washington consensus, and his election, which would have been perfectly predictable if one was following the right trends, was the signal for many of us to stop following heavily narrativized political soap operas and to go deeper, fix our information diets and get to the truth, to empower ourselves on the journey towards financial freedom. It's important to bear in mind that the mainstream media is part of this establishment that we've described, who buy into and benefit from the Washington consensus. Team, opt out of this system by taking your attention elsewhere, removing emotion, and by beginning to understand things at a fundamental level. Team, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, hit that like button, leave a comment and tell me what you thought. Or if you'd like to see more from me, I've got some videos I'm very proud of coming up in the pipeline. Subscribe to the channel and I'll see you in the next one.